Hi, everybody. We're going to give it a try. I think we're having a few problems with the webcast, but Lee, if you're listening, you can give us a shout if you cannot see or hear. This question is from Jennifer Butler, and she asks, this question is working. Have emotions been constructed for this human system to support a gradual growth process? Good God, Jen, I haven't got a clue. But let's take a look at imaginatively how that might work. If it were created for, let's say, a purpose of survival, as you mentioned, the whole process of survival is based on sensing the environment and trying to be adaptive as far as humanity is concerned. When you're looking at first causes and first levels of engagement, gosh, you remember your probably high school science when Lucy was supposed to have washed a bowl of some kind, or and used it for eating food or whatever else she might have done, or he might have done, whatever that could have been. It was a movement towards an active intelligence, a movement in adaptation, a movement to try and survive the world of here. If any of the animal natures of any of the forms that we've had prior to the ones we have now had been hit by a stick or a rock, they might have had a reaction. You might just take a look at the possibility of a tire iron falling on your toe and see what happens with your emotional disposition. Perhaps that might have been very similar. But to support a gradual process of growth, it definitely does that. But we've taken emotion, so we believe, and moved it into a mental sphere, so that, and we call that sphere a sphere of intensity when we're thinking or we're acting on a concept or belief that we have, and we're trying to make some kind of sense or trying to develop some kind of a baseline way of engaging in our everyday life. And usually it's based on information and experience that we've had in our lifetimes. That's how we tend to do things. Now, the question would be as well, does emotion stimulate a kind of image in our minds that relates to a personalization of sorts, like a self-focus, a relationship with the need to be valued by others or ourselves, and at the same time, the need to then engage with needing to be more right than anybody else. A process of competition at least seems to develop, certainly develops physically. If you have someone who is very strong in the physical body, they cultivate a belief that they're more important than others who are weaker. And they prove that to themselves, and they maintain that particular stance simply because they can. The same might be true emotionally. If you can yell and scream louder than anybody else, you emotionally and strongly, let's say, target life as if you're bullying your way through it, and others should pay attention to you because you can yell louder and maybe still physically stronger. We tend to do these kind of young things not knowing that that's what they are. And if they produce results for us, then what do? We have an interest in ourself that means that we are very vital and very important in the world. And our views are more important than someone else's views. It's not a very highly intelligent way of doing things from a mental point of view, but it is a highly attuned way of doing things from a physical and an emotional point of view because it gets results. And our whole world is unfortunately results oriented. Um, Great difficulty there. And we're still striding in, kind of with great big boots on and sinking in lots of emotional mud, physical mud, and not allowing ourselves to pull away from these kinds of what would you call them? I would call them abstractions that are mm, sincerely there from a particular point of view, but perhaps fairly low on the totem pole with respect to engaging with higher states, because this question is going to move into a concept of higher states. Let's say we have an army or an army of strong people, and we can fight another country because they only have an army of middling people, but they're smart and they can sometimes figure out ways of winning battles. But in the long run, we believe our army is bigger and better and stronger, and therefore we'll win. But we would only think that way based on our way of looking at, or our focus on ourself and how we value ourselves based on what we have to value and what our belief system is. If you say have emotions been constructed for this human system to support a gradual growth process, boy, you would have to stop and think and wonder then, my God, could the same thing happen if you were mentally focused? And what would that look like? Well, if you're mentally focused and had an idea that you believed is the only truth, and it could include no other truths, it's fairly baseline stuff. And maybe that's similar to thinking that your brawn is more important than, or your emotional brawn is more important than thinking things through for, let's say, a broader good, if you can even think like that. Because that has problems too. If you're a thinking person, you can come up with problems for that one. But nonetheless, the broader good in a world that's 8 billion people makes some pretty strong sense. But unfortunately, it's not always the way we think. And then Jung goes on, and did humans develop these emotions for survival? Probably, but also, basic survival. I would think if you're thinking along the same stream that we were just talking about with respect to Lucy, no pun intended, well, maybe a little, then you can understand the great need to broaden beyond certain levels of belief, but at the same time, you can see how difficult it is to do so. Because when you're engaging with a kind of emotional intensity that seems to be highly valued by groups or people who engage in their day-to-day in a particular way, their own personalizations that are valued by them, why should they change them if they get their way? So there's no real sincere willingness to go inside and see what makes sense there, even on the mental level, often. So somehow we have to broaden our view with respect to um, the emotional, physical, and the mental orientations. Uh, but that, of course, is not only an individual thing, but it's a collective thing as well. We have tremendous levels of collectivity, groups, you could say, who have no time for anybody else's view other than the ones they have. This is a consistency in our world. Also, from my point of view, a real dilemma. But if you're looking really close, insightfully, you can see yourself caught up in these levels of perception or thought. Certainly thought and then reaction, and then a search for a way to defend and validate what might be real for you. But at the same time, hard to get out of it because not really open to getting out of it. So it would seem that we would have to experience something different that made some sense to it and had some great value enough to allow us to reconsider what we know is truth, quote, quotes, or right. Or if you look at the individuality of all of these things, this concept of continual engagement with others and putting them down so you can be lifted up. This goes on all over the world in the business field. It goes on in religious backgrounds, philosophical backgrounds, science. Uh, Case in point, Einstein's views were different than Bohr's a little bit, and so therefore there was always a little bit of an interaction between those two kind of semi-groups in science. Truths on both sides of the fence, but wow, at least they didn't come to annihilating each other, as can easily happen from a physical, emotional perspective. It's always hoped that we're growing out of this way into a broader perspective, at least from one point of view, a way of looking at the possibility that this can happen more and more often. But at the same time, when you look around at the world, Jen, you see the dilemmas of the battles that go on, deep emotional battles that go on, that validate, and physical battles that validate a person's way of thinking versus some other way of thinking. There's always this kind of interaction that has to be involved with personalities. Um, Ideas are really interesting, but if they come from somebody else, they're not so interesting. This is a very interesting thing that we have. It's very physically based. It's a mental facility, very physically and very deeply emotionally physically based. Kind of semi-low rungs on the ladder of old Jacob's ladder in the Old Testament, one would think. However, not always thought that way by each individual who thinks that way, that's for sure. So maybe we have a long way to go. And maybe perhaps it was there for gradual growth. Uh, I always like the Adam and Eve story, as you bring up. Did humans develop them for survival, or did they come? Where did they come with, or do they come with this form? Well, your guess is as good as mine, but it seems to be that they came with this form. When were they developed? No clue. Maybe at the beginning, right at the beginning, beyond, maybe before we were really human in nature. But it's an opinion. Is their development related to the Adam and Eve story? Well, I never tire of telling the Adam and Eve story from a different perspective. But so let's look and see. Maybe it's a possibility. But this, of course, is just one way to tell the Adam and Eve story. You look at the Adam and Eve story just off the cuff and you say, well, here's Adam. He was created by a breath of God, highest state possible, maybe way beyond our understanding. We can't make life. We can create from life itself, but we can't make life. We can deal with the DNA and spruce it up a bit and mix it up a bit. And sometimes we might even think we know what we're doing, but it's a whole lot of stuff we still don't have a clue about. The very minute micro level of engagement with DNA is still a mystery to us in microbiology. And I'm not a microbiologist, but talk to one, they'll tell you. They're try to be fairly honest. But here's his story. Here's Adam. And the story goes that this Adam was formed out of clay and the breath of life was blown into him. And then it seemed that he was in a state capable of engaging with a high state, communicating clearly, literally with God in the Old Testament. So God looks at this guy and says, well, who knows what he says, but according to the story, he says, look, this guy's all alone. He's lonely. Another way of looking at that might be say, how are we going to create another being? How are we going to get Adam to be pregnant so he can link up with those lower engaging forms in this territory of matter so that there can be a link between a high state and the lowest of states? Oh boy, ran into trouble right there, didn't we? Now we'll just pause for a few seconds to see if this is Lee calling. It's not. Sorry, Lee. Thought you might be telling us something about that. Something that's going on. So anyway, so he says, maybe what we can do is we'll take a rib out of the breath of Adam. We'll take a rib because the breath of God is in there. Breath of consciousness of this state is in the lungs, the breathing. God's breath is in Adam's lungs. So we want to maintain God's breath, and we want to put that in another being that can have progeny. This is my story. Hey, look, it's an option. So out of the rib, he creates Eve. So Adam and Eve are one, not two, one. So now here's another problem. They're okay at this high state, but how are we going to get them into a state that drops down into the lower state? Because they're in another state. They're in a high state right now. So he says, oh, yeah. He's a pretty smart guy, this God. So he said, look, here's what we might try. There is a tree of life and a tree of knowledge, and they are at one. They are together at this high state. So we'll get Mr. Snake. He's God's messenger. relative to the old Greek gods, like Caduceus and Hermes. He says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get this snake, the messenger. They won't understand what they're doing. They have to drop down into these other states so that there can be a fusion with the high state and the low state, at least potentially. But we'll get them to eat of the apple. How are we going to do this? Well, we'll get the messenger to tell Eve that if she eats this apple, it will be very gratifying. It'll be good for her. And of course, she can get Adam to eat the apple. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means their very physical system will begin to function. Not only in the high state will they function, but in an in-between state where their physical form is starting to function, but they're still connected to a higher state. Wow. Whoa, that's a great deal. It's okay. So you have to remember that God's breath is love. It's energy. It's love. We live, we love in breath. Without it, we couldn't. So the snake talks to Eve and said, look, this is really great. You'll really enjoy it. And even Adam would, but I think he's afraid he wouldn't even talk to he wouldn't even try to eat it on its own because he's too linked up with God. You know, you have to remember that's part of the times, because the male aspect was the big deal in those days. Well, from my point of view, they were both big deals. So the snake gets Eve to eat of the apple, and it's wondrous. So she gets Adam to eat of the apple, and it's not too bad. So little they know, they've gone from a high state to a middle state, and the more of the engaging with the matter world, the more the matter world engages with them. Slowly they engage with the matter world, and their progeny does as well. And the links between the high state and the low state are there unconsciously, because they are losing the consciousness of and awareness of God through the generations of engagement, literally, but seeding that old form. The old form meaning the animal form of the human being. That's an interesting story, and it's another take on it. But here's another take as well. Continue on. And the brutishness or the coarseness of the lower systems begins to be a little bit more, less brutish. And the link up still lies within just by an engagement with other forms. The two begin to fuse together. They synthesize. So within the DNA, there's a movement towards an engagement with the perception of higher states. All through our many years, I would say, we used to call all kinds of people witches and all kinds of other things, but all kinds of spiritual things. And we're very creative. We can come up with names for everybody and anybody that agrees or disagrees with us. We do this all the time. We do this because we're trying to preserve our relationship with being important. Self-important is primarily what it is. Now, here's the dilemma. Becoming conscious of a higher state at first makes you more self-important. You're in a movement towards becoming more engaged with a state that enables you to see the difference between the level of coarser matter and the level of higher engagement. And it becomes less and less personalized as you move towards that secondary or intermediate state again. Because the idea is perhaps, from my point of view, is regaining a link while in these states with higher states. Understanding a relationship that we have within ourselves and bringing it out to a conscious level and knowing the difference between the personalization self and a higher engagement with the self that is literally able to recognize and engage with higher states. Wow. Well, that would be, in some people's belief, involution and evolution. Well, in the meantime, we set ourselves up because here we go again. We're ingenuitous. Oh boy, we're ingenious. We create groups of people who are more important than other people, and it's so fantastic that we can do all these things, except one minor detail is we tend to become coarser as we do this to validate and protect our version of what must be right when it doesn't need protection. Because at the higher states, no matter what you believe on these states, you recognize and perceive others on higher states. And the belief system doesn't stand up. So the personalization is what I'm talking about, of how important you are, becomes less important. Well, I think the Greeks had it on us all. They kind of figured this one out. At least I'm giving them credit for that. They had a bunch of gods, and they were powerful from their point of view. And they were self-focused. And they were semi-organized. They were always kind of pretty oily. They liked to get their own way because they were more right than others were right. They start wars between the gods and the titans and blah, 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 blah. They were just highly sophisticated, human-like, coarse beings that didn't know what to do with themselves because they were focused on their own self-interest. Neither good nor bad. It's just perhaps a warning that as we gain access to other states, we may act out somewhat similar to those Greek gods. That's a warning in the coarser states as well. Well, whether you feel dominant and bullish in the physical body, in the emotional dispositional system, or the mental orientations where everyone else isn't as smart as you are, you're acting still coarsely because your focus is on your own self-interest. You might only be there where you are for the purpose of understanding people like that so that you can soften that coarseness and begin slowly to engage with higher states. All the Greek gods could fly. That didn't help them become spiritual. Spiritual, then you got another definition. What are you going to call spiritual? Someone who can do stuff that you can't do? Good God. It's not something we should aim for, maybe. But it appears like as if that's part of the territorial orientation that we prescribe when we're thinking of, to ourselves, I mean, when we're thinking of becoming more and more able as a spiritual being, you could say. Another area is information. The right information, the information that you believe is the only right information, whatever that would be. Whoever can push harder. If you keep pushing, you win. If you keep pushing, you lose because you fall in love with you. If you keep telling yourself that you have the roar of a lion, you lose. You engage with the love affair that you have with yourself. Brilliant as you might be, thinking you're the only great one or superior to others, you lose. Considering the possibility that all of that is just one step. Now back away from that step and move forward into an understanding that is beyond your own love, your self-love, your self-interest, your self-importance. Love is a tricky word. So I know I'm in trouble right away. Concept of love has so many different definitions. There's a kind of interesting concept of love where you're almost immobilized by the engagement that love has in you. And you do not want to move, don't want to breathe, don't want to say anything, don't want to have anybody talk to you. You don't want to lose that extended minute, second, hour, week, month, year of that expression that is occurring in you, that you are noticing the experience of it that hasn't got anything to do with anybody, including you. That's an act of love that is tremendously deep, beyond most of our experience. Some of us have had some inklings into it. Everyone who has knows it was not caused by us, but something else, deeper, beyond what we can define. But we know it. And we know there's something different than the images that we've constructed and present and engage. And our search continues to reestablish exactly how it was before, even though that was a piece of a movement towards engaging with higher states. If we're not careful, we will think that is the only engagement that we can have that could be called an engagement with a higher state. Because we define everything. I think this same Adam and Eve story has a tremendous link from this perspective with the Kabbalah, with the concept of Jacob's ladder, the Kabbalah, with the chakras in the East, the Taoists, the Buddhists. the Hindu orientations, both the Christian and the Muslim orientation, and any other orientation, any other that relates to a movement through various levels of engagement and preparation, keyword, into at least beginning to know that there is something beyond our particular versions of this state, our state here or other states, because we will identify and define all states, and we will define poorly all states. It's not our fault. It's what we do. So we do it in the language of us, not some other language that we can anticipate or relate to. We do it in what we can, the words and the engagements that we have, all of those that we can relate to, because they have to have meaning for us. Each one of us in our movement towards a version of internal growth might take a kind of image with us, or not, whatever. But here's an image. At higher states, anyone able to perceive at those levels do not see another able to perceive at those levels as less than them. Christian orientation was something similar to, if I remember it correctly, if you can perceive energy levels in another that relate to them growing internally. I think it was something, if you can see me meaning the Jesus orientation in others, then you are within you, you can perceive the wonder of God in others. So look to see God in others as opposed to look to see their foibles. You can't miss their foibles. You'll see them through you. You've got them. They've got them. We've got them. All of us have. But if you can see that energy in another, then it's wondrously valuable to recognize that they are growing where they are growing, even if they use it for their own self-interest. Higher state beings know that those perceivers of that level would not use that energy for anything that would pertain to get in their own way. Oh, maybe at first everybody goes through something like that. But as time goes on, there is a recognition of others who have touched that level of the Kabbalah, of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, of a movement of energy through those chakras. And I'm talking about perception here. And there is an interaction and a reaction that relates to community as opposed to separation. In our level of engagement, most often, it's a relationship with separation. Individuality is queen or king. Independence is a real word. You are dependent reflexively on that which lies within you. You are dependent on the unconscious reactions that you engage with for the purpose of validating your own self-interest. This is normal for all of us. It's hard to hear, but it's important to know. Deeply valuable as a person engaging and living in at least that second level of awareness. It's okay to be a person growing, as opposed to battling with verbiage to say that you're a person all grown up. It's okay to be a person growing. That way you know you are growing. Don't let anybody interfere with you in your growth. Everybody will. You'll wish to be validated by others. It's the way it works. Here. Even as you begin to be consciously aware of others who are already engaged with some of those states, you also always have a sense of vulnerability inside of you where you're kind of grateful to be able to be aware of it. That means there's a link there, something similar, and you're in a movement towards going beyond your own self-interest, even though you'll take it with you so that you can see self-interest. You see through you. You're a big set of glasses, not these, some others, your own. And it's a really wonderful trip. Sure, fine, a bit scary because you're into the unknown. But it goes slow, as you said, Jen, so that you can slowly engage and try to move past what you've already set up as the way life should be for you. And it turns out that it's still similar to what it was before. But you see better, you see differently. You see yourself as an individual, and as the sages said, a human being. And that's a discovery that is really worthwhile having. Well, I think that's the best I can do with that one, Jen. There was one other comment that I had written down about trust and honesty within yourself. It's really very interesting. If you make up an image of yourself and you protect that image, you believe that image to be true as honestly as you can. One tiny little element of recognition in another similar to you will help you to perforate that image. Not negate it, perforate it. Can I have a Maureen, get me some water. Excuse me. I have a dry throat. I think the perforation of that image is subtle and it can be really soft. You can make it hard, but it's not worthwhile. It's almost to the point where prior to that you thought you understood everything. After that, you didn't. And the most wonderful idea about knowing that you didn't really understand everything is there's a flood of understanding that comes in that is eloquent and wonderful as long as you don't try to protect what you had on the docket before. It's like an opening, and it is quite fascinating because you recognize right away that the method of survival before was okay and normal. It could be used by anyone, including yourself, because it was. But then you're curious about how it can broaden out, how you can let it soften and try something else a little bit. And it's, again, slow process, but suddenly it allows a broader opening to occur within you instead of your reflex. When it starts to come, you almost have a second or two to soften it down. And you can wonder if there's something else that might be different or more helpful. And after a bit of practice, you begin to have an idea that was quite different than the ones you had before. Now, doesn't make that idea perfect. It makes that idea a movement beyond what you were holding before and insisting on defending. And what you're doing is just shoving a little bit of your willingness to go beyond your boundary, shoving it just a little bit so a little perforation can occur so you can understand deeper, react slightly differently, engage slightly differently, and a broadening can occur. Most likely you'll attempt to close that down, but it's been open. It will occur in other places. And slowly you'll start to make some sense of something a little bit broader. The big thing is to have enough patience to wait it out and be okay with you. And not, in the meantime, try not to elevate yourself and put yourself down or to listen to others that might be doing the same thing. I wish everybody well with this. It is most a fascinating trip, and it's really worth the taking. Good night.